Picture yourself in a world that has no nation states, no centralized authorities, and where temporary micropowers organize or give shape to the whole order, sociopolitically speaking, of the system. Do you think, how do you see the lone wolf terrorism phenomenon there? Do you see it present, or you think it's possible to think about self-organized political interactions without having any central authority?
Great question. I like the scenario. It's one that I often dream about. I think it's one that is fascinating, and I think, to be honest, a world without nation states would be a better world.
Yes, absolutely agree.
At least in theory, right?
Yes.
But I think that there's always, whether it's lone wolf terrorism specifically or other expressions of violence, right? I think, to be honest, it's very hard to imagine a world without those. But I wouldn't necessarily say, maybe that's a bit of a cop-out, but I wouldn't say that it would necessarily be worse, or that it would be a situation of chaos or anarchy in society, and that there would be lone wolves everywhere, right?
Yeah.
Because if we think about the mindset of the lone wolf, and think, for example, about a particularly identity crisis or grievance that the lone wolf might have in terms of a feeling of being victimized, marginalized, a lack of sense of belonging, a lack of aspirations, and seeing opportunities for the future, both material and immaterial, and actually then, as part of that process, come to actively resist that and actually seek positive connection, purpose, and meaning, and a sense of belonging, right? So if we know that some of those drivers are around this sense of victimization, marginalization, belonging, uncertainty about the future, a lot of research shows that those are some of the key drivers, not the only ones, but certainly part of that. Then you might begin to imagine how communities that are differently constituted and have more, I guess, at the level of meaning-making process and rituals around belonging that might potentially be more inclusive through these micro-level interactions within local communities, is something that you say, well, could potentially provide very strong sort of community resilience that could mitigate some of this violent extremism, right? Yes. Now, this is hypothetical, so we are talking hypothetical. We're not able at the moment to experimentally test this, but it's an interesting, I think, thought process. And so what it comes down to is then to also accept, I think, that part of the solution so a lot of the solution doesn't lie in overseas military intervention, right? Mm-hmm. Although, undeniably, in the case of Islamic State, we're now in a situation where probably that's part of it. But they also need to indeed look in terms of, and there's growing research in this space, around how can we strengthen community resilience, right? Yeah. And what can they do in terms of mitigating and building, let's call them, protective factors to this violent extremism that we've been discussing. So I think that's a really interesting thing. So rather than at the level of counter-narratives and hearts of minds, it's actually on the ground strengthening of ties, of adaptability, of the ability of people to respond to, cope with, and change with changing circumstances, challenges, crises, etc. I think is something quite powerful, not just at the level of the individual, but also at the community level, right? And then by extension, I would say what I'm particularly interested in is a little bit broader than this, but how might we then also foster, say, new critical and cultural pedagogies, right, to in that process to foster those new forms of consciousness and belonging. So now that looks really far removed from lone wolf terrorism, so there's no one-on-one connection or causal relation. But I think it's interesting to think about those things and what potential they might hold, and how then might we be able to further explore and develop our thinking around that into the future. So that's sort of a long answer to a complex hypothetical question.
No, an even more hypothetical one, because what I'm working on at the moment is thinking of ways in which we can reduce possible negative outcomes if we had an anarchy society. And one of the things that have come to my mind is that if we had a world where virtual reality is everywhere already, then this connection with the self that you've mentioned plays a very big role in Lone Wolf Terrorism would decrease the interest of somebody in engaging in this type of dynamics, because in your virtual reality world you can be anybody you want, you can do anything you want. So if you have these inclinations, you can either experience them or you just don't feel that disconnection with society that makes you in the real world do something like that. What do you think about this?
It's I like your scenario. If I just think about, okay, what evidence have I seen for this? I think indeed, and I think you intended this way, but we sort of don't want to draw too sharp distinctions between sort of the virtual and the physical world. So no, it's about the interaction between them and the interconnection, how they might actually strengthen each other, right?
Yes.
So I think that's a really good point, because when I look at some of the case of Lone Wolf Terrorism that Mark Ham and I studied, there's a number of cases where individuals, in a way, experienced what you described, and so they found that solace and sense of belonging, a sense of self. They found it in online communities where they couldn't find it in the physical world. Now, one of the problems was there's often the online communities they connected with were very radical, and in fact were very much part of their formation of that ideological belonging, where they felt they were warriors for this violent cause. And so, for example, through engagement with online white supremacist networks and things like that, right, or online jihadist website and a number of platforms there. So, in that sense, you could say, well, it could still work both ways. So actually, the online or an extension, the augmented or virtual reality, in a way, can both buffer and provide protection against that, but it could potentially also exacerbate it. So, in that sense, that would kind of almost be a research question, right, or a hypothesis. And I don't know how you would test it. That's more your area, but it's worth. I think it's one worth looking into for sure.
Yes, because it's the world where we're heading to.
Totally. Yes. Don't get me started. I wasn't virtual reality a little bit, but I was never really didn't know much, about the augmented reality space. And then my 5-year-old son came hide a book from the library about dinosaurs, and it says, "Hey, it has an augmented reality thing in it, right?
Cool.
So you hold your iPad onto the book, and the dinosaurs come out, and they walk around your room and things like that." And I'm like, "What the hell is this?" And it's great, and they love it, and my 2-year-old son loves it too. And I'm thinking, well, this is where it's heading. And I'm the dinosaur here, I'm out of touch, because then it becomes so normal. Yes. And so every morning they go and do it, and play with the dinosaur and take him in their hands and then walk him around the room. And I'm like, whoa, it's fascinating stuff. Yes. Yeah, I feel old when I see that, but I try to build up enough resilience to be able to adapt with the times. So that's the goal, at least.
Which is what we should do as societies as well.
Totally. It's interesting. It's interesting. So we talk about lone wolves going online, yet I'm doing augmented reality with dinosaurs, right? So it's interesting.
Well, Ramon, thank you very much for this interview. Thank you for
my pleasure. Thank you very much.
And insights.
Thank you very much. See you. Bye-bye.